Just to note, the meeting is now being recorded.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the all-party Parliamentary Group for Childcare and Early Education. We are here in the Palace of Westminster, and there are many more of you online. This is increasingly a broadcast, which is great because we're all busy, and you are all busier than we are running your businesses. But you can still tap into the all-party group and hear about the issues that we're discussing. So this all-party group, which I chair, I'm Steve Brine, I'm the MP for Winchester and Chelmsford in Hampshire. Today's meeting is on the early years workforce, which is clearly our best asset and also one of our greatest challenges right now. We all know that the sector is facing lots of challenges at the moment, but chief among them, we think, is the real crisis in workforce recruitment and retention. Many of our friends, our providers, are reporting pretty precarious financial conditions post-pandemic and current cost of living crisis, and they're struggling to pay staff competitive wages. There's also a need to attract more practically skilled people into the sector, whether that's through new vocational qualifications or through addressing the funding itself, and additional costs on providers to help with the operating costs and the costs, of course, of childcare to parents. Now, the proposed relaxation of staffing ratios in early years, which has been discussed for many years, including by the Prime Minister when she was the early years minister, is back on the agenda. You will know that the government consulted on this earlier this year. We think that it would lead to rising costs to maintain the standard of care that earlier years educators are expected to deliver and indeed wish to deliver, as well as meaning that settings will have to turn children away with SEND and struggle with a lack of resources. So far from being a way that it will save parents money, we think there is a great threat to that, and we will discuss some of those issues during the course of the next hour. So in the course of this session, we will explore the solutions, potential solutions to the recruitment and retention challenges that there are, such as the bridging qualification to alleviate the short-term pressures, better support for apprenticeships, and the value and challenges of investment in the sector. I understand this is a very unsettling time for all of you. It certainly is here in Parliament, and we know that those challenges are felt out there in the real world, in the earlier sector especially. Thank you for joining us and giving up an hour of your time. We have a really good suite of speakers today. We have Cheryl Hadland, who's Managing Director and founder of Top Stay Nurseries. We have Stanley, who's a Senior Researcher at think tank Onward. And we have Purnima, Tanuku, Chief Executive of the National Day Nurseries Association, as well as Dr. Kate Hardy from the Leeds Business School, who's joining us online. The first three speakers that I mentioned are here with us in the room, as are colleagues and representative from various colleagues' offices here in the House of Commons. So without further ado, Purnima, thanks so much for being here. Chief Executive, National Day Nurseries Association, you're going to make a few remarks, and then we'll hand on to Luke. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think you already highlighted some of the challenges, but I'm actually going to talk about something positive because I'm a half glass full person. We've had lots of challenges, including settings closing down partially, permanently, temporarily because of lack of staffing. And in terms of workforce qualifications and recruitment campaign is something that we talked to the department for years, but nothing has been done. So what NDNA decided to do is something that we're going to actually launch a campaign across UK for the sector by the sector. And really the aims are to encourage more people to join early years and be part of the real wonderful sector that we are, but most importantly, raise awareness of parents in terms of the value of early education. I think there is still a kind of a myth that, childcare providers just play with children in nurseries and earlier settings. And I think that's something that we wanted to really break that myth. But most importantly, I think the society in general do need to understand how much early years investment actually saves millions in later years. And I think that's really important. And also the workforce who actually work in earlier settings absolutely day to day, they deal with all sorts of issues, from children with special educational needs to children who are having behavioural issues, speech and language issues in terms of complications from COVID. So I think, you know, what we're trying to do is really the main objectives are to highlight this, but recruit more people into the sector, and most importantly, raise that awareness among the politicians as well as parents and general society in general. And we've got some images here. I think, you know, the kind of the audience that we're looking for is across the UK, and it's a non-political campaign aimed at parents, aimed at future workforce, so that they can actually join the wonderful, workforce that we have at the moment. And looking at those images, you can see we're trying to capture all sorts of the areas of earliest workforce, from earliest development in terms of how children develop and progress in early years. And also what I wanted to share is just a video clip. This is something that we're going across UK to settings to actually capture what earliest workforce do on a day-to-day basis. Just a short video clip for you to be able to see. But really what I would urge everybody is to join the campaign, hashtag. We have got 58,000 people who are already engaged. And the Roy Foundation kindly supported this campaign as well, and they're sharing it. And I think it's absolutely wonderful that we need to really raise this voice of earliest sector across UK to really encourage people to come and join us and be part of this wonderful sector. So if you can play that video clip, please, Alan.
For me, there's a little bit of magic in every single day. You can have a really hard day, don't get me wrong, but one of the children will do something or say something or accomplish something, and it's a real sense of pride. And for me, I feel exceptionally privileged, and it is a privilege as well as a massive responsibility, that I'm able to have an impact on these children's ideas of the world at such a young age, at such a young and pivotal age. For me personally, one of my favourite things to teach is diversity, equality, understanding the world, environmental awareness. And these children, they, as sort of softly as it sounds, they are our future. And that's how we change the world into a better and more understanding place. It's by teaching inclusivity and kindness and acceptance. And even with the more sort of traditionally academic subjects, if you like, I love the challenge of making them fun and engaging so that children learn through play and they don't realise they're learning. And personally, I also have a really keen passion at the moment for STEM learning. For those that don't know, science, technology, engineering and maths, because it's the core of how our world functions. And giving children, particularly I find girls who have been steered away from these subjects in previous generations, sort of giving children not only an understanding, but an enjoyment and engagement. It will set them up for all their future endeavours. And I love being able to instill that confidence in them.
Those are the messages we want to push. So please help us to do that and join and please share that campaign. Thank you.
Finished? Thank you. That's great. Thanks very much. I hope this is being appreciated out there. And Luke Stanley, who's sitting to my right, senior researcher at Onward. You're very welcome to our all-party group. Thank you for giving up your time.
No, thank you.
You have the floor.
Very good. Thank you. So yes, as we've just heard, the early years workforce is really struggling with poor retention. And it's something that we at Onward really want to see improve, is keeping people, early years practitioners, in their jobs. At Onward, I lead their work on family and on children policy. So I'll just rattle through a couple of the challenges facing retention. So it's also worth noting that it's not just the number of staff leaving the workforce that matters, but the qualifications held by those leavers. So there's been a significant reduction in the proportion of early years staff who are qualified to at least level 3 certificate, which is needed for managerial positions. So in 2015-16, 83% of the workforce was qualified to this level, but in 2018-19, that's dropped to just 52%, so a fall of 30 percentage points. So why is this happening? Research by the Social Mobility Commission points to a number of factors, including low income, high workload, insufficient training, and low status and reputation in the workforce. Each of these really need to be addressed by the government if we're going to improve retention. So just to go through those in a little bit more detail. First, those employed in the early years workforce were on low income. The average wage for the sector is £7.42 per hour, barely higher than the average wage in the retail sector. So it's understandable that many people would move to better paid and less stressful occupations. Second, there's the high workload that early years practitioners face. The same analysis showed that early years practitioners work longer hours than those employed in sectors like retail. Evidence review of existing studies also found that many early years workers complained about unpaid work, having to care for too many children at once, and having too much paperwork to complete. This suggests that relaxing childcare ratios could fuel further retention problems in the sector. Third, there's the issue of training. Only 17% of early years workers receive job-related training. The Social Mobility Commission's research shows that early years staff are more likely to stay with their employer if the employer offers high full training. It would also make it easier to care for more children at once. That might be helpful for if the government does decide to relax childcare ratios. And then finally, some early years practitioners feel that their work is not respected in the same way that other essential public service providers like teachers or nurses are. That said, there's some evidence this is shifting. A recent Ofsted report noted that as a result of the pandemic, there was increased appreciation of the importance of early years, and many felt honoured to be working to support children during this time. And I know that something this APPG has called on in the past is the parliamentarians to champion the work of the childcare practitioners, and that's something I know would be very valuable. So what the government really needs to do is invest more in the early years workforce by increasing and pushing up training requirements. If these steps are taken, ministers could then perhaps explore this idea a bit more in depth about relaxing childcare ratios, but we need to make sure that the training and the investment is there as well. And just to come back to the point raised earlier, there is really strong evidence to suggest that investing in the early years system would save money in the long run. So research by the London School of Economics and the Royal Foundation has found that the cost of adverse but preventable childhood experiences for England alone is £16 billion a year. That's almost 5 times the spending on early years and childcare entitlements. And we can learn from countries like Canada, who've recently invested $420 million Canadian dollars in attracting and retaining early years workers through initiatives like grants and bursaries for students. And just before I conclude, I'd like to also point out that one of the other things that we're looking at Onward is other challenges in the sort of family and childhood space. So challenges in formal early years sector are linked to these changes in family-based care for kids. So, for example, since 2001, the proportion of older parents, people over the age of 55, living close to their adult child has fallen by 16%. That makes it harder for grandparents to offer informal childcare support, and that puts greater pressure on formal providers. Also, parents are struggling to spend as much time with young kids as they'd like. So, there's separate data from the ONS that shows that a third of both mothers and fathers of children under the age of 4 say that working conditions like long hours, unpredictable schedules make it difficult for them to provide childcare. So alongside changes to the formal early years sector, we also need to address some of these related issues like our economy that means that young people have to move away from home for work, and looking at whether there's ways to help in terms of flexible working and parental leave as well. But yeah, so lots to discuss, and thanks again for having me on.
Very interesting. Thank you, Luke. If you can hear any background noise online, it's because there's a very noisy reception going on next door, but not a lot I can do about that, I'm afraid. Luke, thanks. Right, Cheryl Hadland, Managing Director, well known to many of you, founder of Top Day Nurseries, Aspire Training Team, ready to roll.
I am, thank you very much. And I love the positive messages that we heard there from Purnima, because undoubtedly working in early years is one of the most rewarding jobs you can imagine for those that work in it. Unfortunately, that reward doesn't extend to financial. Anyhow, Tops, yeah, we've been running since 1990, and like most of the people running and owning nurseries in the sector, my first customers were my own children, and now they include my grandchildren. And we're passionate about working with children, can do a lot of work unpaid as a volunteer. In fact, that's what we're doing here at the moment as well, part of the APPG, giving our time to try and promote the sector. I also run a training team because I agree with Luke that training is fundamental in helping to retain your staff, and the apprenticeship scheme runs incredibly well for us. So we're very supportive, and that continues to the extent that many of our apprentices actually work for local providers other than ourselves, because in the sustainable manner that we like to behave, it's something we can spread around. So there's lots of evidence to show that employing apprentices who will then stay for the 18 months will help with retention. We did stay open through COVID, particularly those in hospitals. And yes, we did see lots more appreciation coming through from parents and the hospital for the fact that we do provide such a very valuable service. We're also fortunate that some of our nurseries are in those more affluent areas where we can charge additional extras, which then support those in the deprived areas, because at the moment, nurseries in deprived areas cannot charge any extra funding to parents who just can't afford to pay anything extra. In fact, we've got children going hungry because there's no school meals for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and we're having to try and cope with that as well. So it is really, really tough out there at the moment. If we can move down the slide. And at the moment, I'm seeing staff turnover worse than I've ever seen it in 32 years. At 30%, it's actually higher than that in some nurseries, because in some nurseries we've still got the core staff that we've had for the last 20 years, which is marvellous. Our vacancy level is higher than it's ever been. I need 60 level 3s at the moment. That's over 32 nurseries, and these are the room managers that we absolutely need, and a lot of others as well. And the main reason people are leaving is pay, because our people are generally happy. We look after them, we look after their mental well-being. It's a wonderful job. We give them lots of training, but look at these pay rates. How can we compete with schools, nurses, retail, even the national average wage? And we just can't pay more, even though we'd really like to, because the income isn't there. Neither from the government, local authorities, nor from many, many parents who are obviously being squeezed even more at the moment. So why can't we increase income? Well, at the moment we're blocked from charging additional extras in some cases. It's called a top up to make up the difference between the roughly £4 an hour to maybe the £6, £6.50 an hour that it's costing us. And that produces a really unethical situation for us, because we're having to say, well, this additional extras are for food. Or yoga or something, when the fact of it is it's pay rates, and if we don't pay the staff, then we can't keep them. They can't even eat. We're having to support our staff with charity funds and feed them in the last week of the month. I mean, it really is tough out there, and lots of people working for very, very little. So, and it's just hit us impact wise as well. I mean, Marcus Fish, MP, very kindly opened a nursery for us in Yeovil a couple of years ago. The manager relocated to another nursery, which was absolutely fine, one of our nurseries. And then I think when you lose a nursery manager, you often have an exodus of some of the key staff as well, because that's the time to say, oh, perhaps I'll go and earn some more somewhere else. So they did. And we ended up with, out of 10 staff, with only 3 permanent staff left. Obviously, we had to put the nursery on block, no new children, some of the rooms had to close, and it was a very tough period for the nursery, and at the same time, of course, Ofsted came in. Now, the result's not published yet, but it's not a good one, and it was because not all the children had key workers. Well, you can't using agency staff, can you? Because the agency staff coming in, even your internal agency or casual staff, don't know the children. So this lack of retention and a high staff turnover is now affecting quality. Now, we've got away with it for a few years, but not now. So over the last year, we've had 10 of our nurseries have blocks in place due to lack of staff. And that is a real problem for parents, because if we're saying, I'm sorry, you can't bring a child in today because we just don't have enough staff, whether off with COVID or whether they've actually left. That's impacting local employers, it's impacting parents' wages. it's impacting us, because of course, if we don't take the children, we can't charge fees. So our finances are taking a dip. And this is something we're seeing around the country with nurseries, you know, closing left, right and centre. And what we don't need is mentors and coaches being poached from our nurseries to go and offer guidance to other nurseries. I don't need that. We know how to run nurseries. What we need is staff, and what we need is the money to pay those staff, not extra training on literacy. There's no point training people who, you know, just left. So I just wish we could be listened to. So the main issues are parents' economic circumstances, which has just got tougher, obviously, and the lack of funding per hour. But as important, business rates. I mean, our business rates bill this year is £417,000. That's a lot of money, and if we can not pay that and pay that to staff instead, that would be great. Now, I understand the whole country is struggling financially, but it just doesn't make sense to tax childcare when what we need to be doing is investing in it. Obviously, utilities have gone up hundreds of percentages, inflation over 10% today, wages have gone up 21% in 3 years just to keep pace with market forces. And against that, we've got a government increase of 3.5% last year, 6.8% in the last 3 years. We are grossly underfunded, not just a bit, massively. So there are some of the ranges that we're getting at the moment, below the floor rate that was published by the government, and we can evidence that. And against that, maintained schools are getting nearly twice as much money per hour for the same age children, despite the fact they don't have to pay business rates to get them back, and they get their VAT refunded, and they've got limited opening hours, plus they get capital funding for buildings and sustainable infrastructure, which we don't get. So there's absolutely no doubt that we're on a really, really hard wicket at the moment. So what are the solutions? Well, from a nursery point of view, obviously I want to keep my 800 staff still in jobs as far as I can. So we're cutting costs to the bones. So, you know, we're not buying new resources. We're buying secondhand or getting free resources. We're hoping our resources will last a long time. We're maintaining those with the children. We're reducing our bin collections. We're fortunate that we did invest in insulation and solar panels a few years ago. So we're reaping the benefit of saving energy. We've just started recruiting teachers from abroad, and that might be something that some of you could do as well. It's not easy because the qualifications aren't necessarily transferable, and there isn't a good list of these qualifications and what are acceptable. But if you get a qualified teacher, you can have them for up to 2 years. We're then paying them a level 3 rate, which is not particularly fair, but actually we can't put them into a full management position having just come from another country because they don't know our ethos and our structure. So that's something we can do, and it's great that there have been some rules relaxed in that area to enable us to do that by the government. We appreciate that. We just need to make sure nursery staff are on the short staff list, which they're not at the moment, which means things take a bit longer. And obviously we're really working on our own engagement, retention, recruitment, training, trying to make it as world-class as possible. And those of you who are doing that, you know, that's where we can at least cling on to the people that we've got and try and recruit people with this really positive message. Because I think if, you know, parents got a 17-year-old and they're talking about careers, are they currently going to propose early years? Well, would you, you know, if that means your child's going to be earning 17 grand instead of 28, you know, that's quite a challenge. You've got to really love small children to want to take that hit. The government can do an awful lot more. Please stop business rates. They have in Scotland, they have in Wales. It would mean at least 30p hour and extra for every member of staff, so you're counting it to the penny. Please refund the VAT, particularly on the sustainable resources like insulation, solar panels, double glazing. Again, schools get that, we don't. I know some of the charities do get those two things, which is great. But effectively, we're running like a charity because we don't make a lot of money, and what we do make is reinvested in the business anyway. We're a socially responsible business, being in early years. Increased funding is absolutely vital so that we can pay for quality staff. I mean, I heard someone say this the other day, oh, well, you don't need as much money because you don't employ graduates. I do employ graduates. I have a master's in education myself. I certainly employ graduates around the nursery, but I'd like to employ more. But of course, not all of them are prepared to pay for half what they can earn as a graduate in another sector. So if you funded us more, we could employ more graduates. It's absolutely straightforward. Relaxing the ratios is very interesting because I used to be involved in running a couple of care homes, and we saw that happen there. And actually it works quite well because the centre is made responsible for the quality of care for those children, and you can run at a ratio that suits your children. So if you've got a lot of SEND children, obviously you need a much lower ratio. If you've got a lot of children that are normalised and playing really well together outside and not needing as much guidance, you could potentially go to a higher ratio. But it needs a lot of inspection, doesn't it, to make sure that the provision is right and people are not cramming loads of children into a tiny room, you know, and strapping them up. Because that obviously is not quality education. And at the moment, Ofsted are under so much pressure, they quite often don't inspect for years at a time, unlike CQC who inspect every year. So you can't just relax ratios and space rules and then tinker at it. It needs to be a whole plan of, you know, what's the implications, what would happen if you did that. You'd have to guard against profiteering by potentially a few people out there who might want to do that. But that's the last thing I want to do, because my grandchildren in my nurseries, you know, I want my grandchildren to have the best possible education and care possible, not be crammed into some, you know, small space. And I'd say that the vast majority of people in our sector feel the same way. So SEND children, we are already sending SEND children away because we can't cope with SEND children on a 1-to-4 ratio. You know, if they're breaking other children's fingers, you know, they have to be guarded, supervised, really monitored, managed, given the appropriate activities, and quite often that's one-to-one. So the thought of having more SEND children, there more and more coming through our doors all the time, is a real challenge. I would love to say, yes, let's take absolutely everybody. But if you do that, you'll have more staff leaving and you'll have parents taking children out because of the exposure to a risk. So yes, this absolutely needs a really good look. And just finally, we'd like to see green decisions incentivised, because nurseries fall out of the domestic insulation and also business and even charity categories. So we get no help at all to be greener, even though our small children are the ones that are going to have to live with these decisions. They're the ones that suffer most from air poisoning. They're the ones that will suffer most from lack of the animals and diversity, biodiversity as they get older. And it just breaks my heart that that's what they're going to suffer unless us, this generation, do better now. And finally, we've got the LA Ombudsman at the moment hounding councils, specifically one of our local councils, for charging additional extras. But please, we can't survive without charging additional extras at the moment because the funding is not enough to pay for our staff. Thank you.
Wow. As ever, Cheryl says what she thinks, which is why she's here. No point in giving up your time to come here and sugarcoat it. And that was great. And not only that, you finished literally on the second of where you're meant to be. Thank you very much, Cheryl. I should have said at the start, our Twitter account at APPG Early Years. And if you wish to tweet your thoughts, support, or otherwise, hashtag CEEAPPG would be very helpful. And at that point, I should probably say hello to Colton Common Preschool, who in my constituencies, I know they may be watching, or they will certainly want to watch back. Quite a lot of my preschools do tune in for some reason. And Colton Common, hello to you. I was judging their scarecrow competition on Sunday because they were having an open day, which was a great success for them. No comment, and some of them may have looked like me. Scarecrow sounds and nothing else. Anyway, without further ado, Dr. Kate Hardy, who is online, so not with us, but Associate Professor of Leeds Business School. Kate, very welcome. We will now patch you in, and over to you.
Great, thanks very much. So what I'm going to talk about today is a research project that a team of us did at the Leeds Business School and the University of Bristol. And this is just one part of a pretty major data set. Next slide, please. So yeah, the data set was 5,000 survey responses and 300 in-depth interviews, and we looked at the whole ecology of people providing early years care and education. So nursery managers, early years educators, childminders, nannies, parents and grandparents. So this is just a kind of the section looking at emerging findings around the workforce and specifically recruitment and retention. Some of this will not be news to a lot of people who in this group, but hopefully this can provide some, evidence for, evidence-based policy development. So we found a quarter of managers said that staff turnover was higher than before the pandemic. And this was actually increasing. So the thing I should say is that this research was longitudinal. So we did it we did it in 2020 and we repeated it again in 2021 to make sure that what we were seeing wasn't just a flash during the high point of the pandemic, but to look for enduring patterns. So by wave 2, over half of nurseries had said it was harder to recruit early years educators. Very few reported redundancies through the pandemic, but what we effectively are seeing when we've looked at the numbers is that staff are leaving the sector and they're not being replaced. And what we found in the quantitative data, is a net loss of nursery workers. And the highest proportion we found of these was a decreased number of apprentices. So as we all know, there are immediate problems in the sector in terms of staff in the sector, but we're also storing up long-term problems for the sector in terms of a lack of pipeline of qualified staff coming through in the future. Okay, so we looked a bit closer at at the data to look if there were any particular demographic or spatial features of who it is that is struggling to recruit. So we used the index of multiple deprivation, and we didn't find that there was a particularly significant relationship between problems with recruiting and particular areas of deprivation, for example. The only really significant factor we found was nursery type. So 73% of PVI nurseries were struggling to recruit new workers, and 89% of private nurseries that were part of a chain were struggling to recruit. So really, this was the only significant factor was being in the PVI sector. Essentially, we think this can be explained in terms of some of the issues that Cheryl was just talking about, that the hourly pay, it tends to be lower in group-based providers than school-based providers for many of the reasons that were just discussed. And it's quite a big difference in those rates of pay. So we really are seeing a direct relationship between nursery type and the pay levels associated with that, and an inability to recruit new staff. Okay, so we also looked at childminders, and I think it's really important that we don't forget about childminders who also provide, 12%, approximately 12% of places in the sector. So we found that a lot of the childminders now have a lower income than before the pandemic. 64% said by wave 2 that their income had decreased. About a third of childminders were earning less than £10,000 a year by the end of the pandemic, and that was significantly up, and their mean income has decreased quite a lot. So this decreasing level of income for childminders really is pushing childminders out of the sector, and we see that in the Ofsted. We're seeing that in the Ofsted numbers of turnover and exit. We also asked them about how confident they were about staying in the sector, and that the majority were either not at all confident or only somewhat confident. And again, this was increasing through the pandemic and as we kind of came out the other side. Most worryingly, 63% and 67% from wave 1 and 2 who were not confident said that they would be going into a different sector. So they're not just moving around the sector, moving into different types of provision, they're leaving the sector, they will leave the sector altogether. So what we think is really important about this is that this is a real brain drain from the sector. This is people with a lot of years of experience just leaving the sector altogether and taking that experience, taking those skills with them. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've heard this mentioned and we're all, I think, very familiar with issues around pay in the sector. But I think a really important thing to look at is the relationship between retail wages and early years wages. So between 2013 and 2018, the wage gap between the two groups of staff was falling. So early years work used to be better paid than retail, but between those years, it started to align. Now in 2022, retail wages have actually overtaken early years wages. And I think this is a really important point to note. So there's different ways of calculating what the average is in the sector. But if you look at it at the moment, some predictions show retail at £9.08 and early years at £8.67. We know actually often in early years it's even lower than that. Managers, as Cheryl was saying, report an inability to increase pay, and the thing they point to over and over again is the funding gap for the subsidised hours, as just being the key reason that where they would like to increase pay, they are unable to. The other real issue that comes out again and again is not just kind of static low pay, but poor progression once in the sector. So it's not that apprentices start on low pay, but they can see over the years that their pay can increase and that there's career paths and progression, but it's very static. It sticks at that low level. So one early years educator looked at her own manager and said, my manager works hard. She's earning 21,000 a year. It's a 40-hour week. She's not, I can't imagine she's going to earn much more than that. And an early years educator in a private nursery in London said, I qualified when I was 18, I'm 53. I'm earning minimum wage with 34 years experience. So I think it's really important to pay attention as well at the progression and the path for progression and career progression that's available or unavailable in the sector. Okay, so just to look a little bit at some of the reasons that people gave, both managers and childminders and educators were giving for exiting the sector. And again, these will be very familiar to people. It's hard to emphasize, I think, from the data that we've got, just how undervalued and unrecognized workers and staff feel in the sector. It's really hard to overstate that. So time and time again, staff talked about not just lack of pay, but seeing that their work was not recognized, not being seen as essential workers during the pandemic, and the actual social value of their work not being recognized, it being seen as low skill, for example. This is really leading to low morale, declining well-being, mental health, as well as a care and brain drain. And this is partly due to a widening of responsibilities that occurred during the pandemic, doing more social work, more cleaning, but also a lot more safeguarding work, quite emotionally taxing work. The vast majority of childminders, so 68%, said they don't feel valued by society, and 82% of managers reported that their concern for the mental health and well-being of their staff had increased. So there is a real crisis around morale and well-being, as well as in addition to pay and sector. Next slide. The other thing that we found was there's quite often, people talk to settings closing down, but we know from the research that we did that a lot of nurseries did everything they could to try and weather the storm of the crisis. And what this led to was work intensification for staff and these expanding responsibilities, which I referred to. But the other thing that nurseries did to try and stay open was to make quite a lot of changes to staffing. So almost half took actions, including changing contract conditions, cutting the number of staff, and not renewing temporary staff contracts. And these are the sort of things that are leading to changes in the nature of work for early years educators, but also the conditions in which they do them. And again, in wave 2, private settings were most likely to report the decreased numbers of full-time employment contracts. So, you know, people who can be key workers, as you said before, because they are on full-time contracts. And as I said before, this has got a real pipeline problem because of some of the changes made at this time. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to finish off, what are some of the ways in which this kind of workforce crisis can be addressed? Some of those have been mentioned already today. There needs to be urgent attention to pay and conditions in the sector. And as has been mentioned, a lot of that can only be addressed by changes to funding models. There really needs to be, we think, full recognition of early years as education. So, for example, consistent use of terms within policy documents, using the term educator to refer to staff in the sector, and I think this would go a long way as well in terms of valuing early years as a source of education and not just as, you know, watching children while their parents work. The free entitlement, we think, has to be brought in line with the actual cost of delivery, and it needs to be reviewed annually, and it has to be pegged to the national living wage so that that gap doesn't just increase year on year. The slides have just disappeared. Disappeared for everyone. Yeah. We think we need to see creation of a really progressive career path with pay progression and backed by a pay framework that has also to be backed by sufficient funding to make sure that that progression, staff can make that progression and stay in the sector. Because one thing we were told repeatedly by staff is that they do want to stay, but they either don't feel able to because of the pay levels or because they don't see a future in which they can progress. We think more recruitment campaigns to attract staff into the sector. So it's great to see the NDNA campaign. And then also we think not forgetting home-based early years providers. So not forgetting childminders, who are a significant proportion of the sector. So including long-term funded training opportunities as well as the funding models for them. Okay, thanks very much.
Very good, Kate. Thanks very much. Lots of people commenting that they appreciate your research, saying it chimes with what they have. So, do we have any questions that are coming up, or any raised hands?
We can ask parliamentarians first if they have
yes, or people in the room. Yeah.
The benefit goes online. I think it's Mike Watson, former Labour education spokesperson in the House of Lords. I've enjoyed all contributions. I mean, to be honest, there wasn't a lot new in them, which is part of the depressing reality, I suppose. But I particularly wanted to ask two questions, one to Purnima and the other to Cheryl. The thing about your campaign, could you just say a bit more about who's involved and how widely that involved beyond the National Day Nurseries Association? There are other organisations, Early Years Alliance and so on, also involved. And to Cheryl, you mentioned, if I caught you correctly, at one point you said that you would like to pay staff more, but there was a cap in some form or other in either local authorities or the DfE were preventing you from paying more. I may have got that wrong, but that's. I think I'm right in saying if I'm not telling me, but if I am, can you maybe clarify that question? Thanks very much.
The campaign is started with the NDNA because the board of trustees decided that nothing is going to happen because the government aren't going to do anything. So NDNA will actually invest in doing this because, you know, to produce the package of images and the kind of, a toolkit, because we've also got toolkits for providers to share with the parents as well.
Yeah.
And it is a non-political campaign, because what we wanted to talk about is actually the value of early education and the value of being an early practitioner. So yes, we're working with all other organisations, all partners as well, because everybody has also developed their own campaigns in terms of pushing the message out. So the more messages we push out, the better, really. And because we operate across UK, we are actually running this campaign in Scotland and Wales as well. The Scottish and Welsh governments have actually not only had a workforce strategy as part of their earliest expansion, but they also had similar campaigns going back a couple of years ago. What this campaign is doing is actually encouraging even more people to join the workforce. In fact, we were delivering projects to actually recruit more people and train them, and to actually put them into nurseries in Wales. The Welsh government invested heavily. And I think that is what is lacking in England at the moment, because we don't have a workforce strategy. And when the 30 hours started, when the 15 hours started, when all the extension of hours started, I'm glad Kate used the word subsidised, because that's what it is, because it's not current cost. There was no plan in terms of what kind of workforce do we need, what levels of qualifications do we need in order for us to deliver this policy. I think that was what was lacking. So that's why we really wanted to invest in this campaign, to really push that message out to parents and society in general, because you'll see tweets from certain parts of the community to say, well, I don't have children, why should I pay for somebody, to be looked after by somebody else through my taxes? That's the kind of comments you get from people. So really to raise that understanding and awareness across everybody, and we kept it deliberately non-political, because we want all politicians to actually buy into this. So that's what's happening now across UK.
Okay, so you referred to the cap. It's not a cap in terms of how many pounds we can pay per hour to a number of staff. It's a limited income. So we only get, say, £4 an hour from the local authority per child. We're only allowed to have a number of children in a room that is 2.3 square metres per child. So, and we have statutory ratios on the staff as well. So we can't increase our productivity. So we've got a limited amount of money that we can spend on staff, and obviously mortgage and the utilities and pensions and all the rest of the stuff that we have to spend. If we spend more than our income, we go bust, because we're in the PVI sector. We can't just kind of create money like some people do. So if I'm going to stay in business, I can't pay more than my income. But I'm actually on the edge now, because I can't retain people on the wages I can pay from that income.
Following that, if the ratio was to be relaxed in terms of staffing, it strikes me that unless there was sufficient funding in addition, it would be enough to simply relax the ratio.
Not at all. No, not at all.
I think it's not only funding. We're struggling as a team to actually recruit people at all levels, not just level 3 or level 2, but also people with the right skills and the right attitude. I think it's really important. And I think that the way that the ratio debate has been sold to public is that this somehow is going to save costs to parents, and that is totally wrong. All the things that we talked about today, everybody talked about today, for years the funding never kept pace with inflation, let alone the government imposed cost increases. Business rates have gone up. National minimum wage, living wage has gone up, and now, of course, cost of living and the energy crisis. So all these things are actually making it even more difficult to operate a nursery business. So recruitment is a major issue. So ratios aren't really going to be the answer. But what we are saying is, yes, we do want to talk about space, not because we want to kind of put children in a pen. We do want to talk about flexibilities, not because we want to get away with actually doing the least possible kind of safeguarding issues we can, but we do want to talk about funding, because that needs to keep up with any increases. So what we're talking about is a comprehensive review of why do we need subsidized childcare in this country, but most importantly, from a child's perspective, what is it from the child's perspective that we need to look at, putting child at the centre of it, and look at a comprehensive review, because successive ministers have come in, opened the lid, closed it again, and all we ended up was sticking fastest on it. And now is the time to actually look at the overall picture and look at where we want to be. most importantly, where we want our children to be in the next 5 and 10 years.
What conversations have you had with the new minister on this score?
We've had an introductory meeting,
Mhm.
and as you know, there are lots of rumours floating around, and I hope they are rumours, about paying money to parents, to completely abolishing ratios, to completely getting away from childcare funding. And obviously, all these things have been discussed, and we did ask the minister about, what those issues are. And she did say that, they're looking at all options, but could not actually give us any sense of where the policy is going to go at this point in time. And I think, what's important is the government haven't responded yet to the ratio consultation. That needs to come out first. And then they need to really engage with the sector to be able to understand these challenges, because these are real challenges. We see closures, 65% increase in the private community.
I think we may expect a statement from the Secretary of State in the aftermath of the medium-term fiscal event on 31st of October, because they're talking about various supply side changes at that point. Obviously, there's been rumours in the press around the abolition of ratio altogether, which on the surface level, playing devil's advocate, sounds quite good, because, well, why wouldn't we trust the sector to do what we know the sector does best? The danger in that is exactly that. It's dangerous. Just for those watching who will understand exactly why I'm saying that, can you elucidate why I'm saying that, Cheryl? Why is it dangerous?
Well, because if you're really pushed and you don't have the income, you're going to put more children into one member of staff, and there are risks in doing that. There are risks to the child in terms of their health and safety. There are risks to the child in terms of their educational opportunities. I mean, just on a practical basis, if you're trying to watch several children, the idea is, as a practitioner, is that you observe the child and you see what their next steps are, and then you enable the child to do those activities. So if you're going to watch a lot of children, that makes each child's attention a lot lower. So it's going to be hard on the child. I mean, my colleagues at work are saying, oh my goodness, it's going to be, if I have to have 5 instead of 4 children, it's going to be 20% more work. And I'm saying, well, no, actually, because you can only work as hard as you're working. What it means is the child will get less attention. And if they're all very happily engaged and, they're settled in and they've got their regular key worker, that might not be a problem. But if you've got a child that's autistic or challenged or has not been able to speak to anybody during COVID, then that's a major problem. And of course, our current 2-year-olds, they're the ones that have suffered most through COVID. They need more attention, not less attention.
And of course, the thing for people to look out for is that any change to ratios would presumably require a change to the Ofsted framework.
Of course.
Because it makes it very clear
yes.
where ratios are right now.
Yes,
so,
and it has to match the square footage as well for the rooms.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no point telling us you can have 5 children if your room only takes 8.
So in some regards, that probably slows everything down in terms of any threat that this presents to the sector, because of course that would have
change
to
the
be
children.
that would, exactly. And right now, Parliament is not predictable for the government. So anyway, any other questions that you wanted to flag to us from the Secretariat?
Yeah, so we've had a question here from Helen. She asks, there is talk of a bridging qualification, which is great, which is a great idea in theory. However, our problem with recruitment is now, is it not possible, even in the short term, to count apprentices in the qualified ratio? And we'd like to get the opinions of the panel on that.
I think if I can answer that, these are some of the solutions that we've been discussing with the department for quite a long time. And I think, what we've been saying is that there is a crisis, and there has been a crisis. COVID only exacerbated the situation now. We've had the recruitment and workforce crisis for a number of years. But all these suggestions, they haven't really been taken up and to really explore those opportunities. So that's where the sector is at the moment. What the sector is saying is actually, we want you to look at qualification levels, we want to look at flexibility, we want to look at Ofsted, and when they visit nurseries, the example that Cheryl gave, if you've got agency staffing and if you're actually short of staff, and straight away, the impact on that is Ofsted inspection happens, is you're grading. And I think, all those things should have been looked at, but suddenly throwing ratios into the equation, A, isn't helpful, and B, is really counterproductive, because from a staffing point of view, research already Kate shared shows that a lot of the workforce are actually having well-being issues and mental health issues.
Ratios is a red herring
Yeah.
in this whole debate.
Absolutely.
And some might say a deliberate distraction. I certainly would say that.
Absolutely.
The some apprentices are stunningly good, and I would sometimes rate an experienced apprentice who's perhaps done a level 1 in the nursery as well as being much better than someone with a degree,
Yes.
that's perhaps unrelated,
Yes.
that's come in. So to that extent, I would like to have the authority to assess the competence of that person and say whether they count as qualified or not. So that kind of relaxation would be useful, but again, open to abuse by the unscrupulous, if there are any, but hopefully there aren't very many in the sector.
Okay, probably the last one, because we need to stick to our time and vacate the room at 3.
Sure. So we have a question here from Kat, and it's on some of the research that was presented earlier. She's asked, why are early years educators being compared to those in the retail sector? Is it not more appropriate to compare them to, for example, teachers, nurses, or others in similar care and education roles?
In the sense that they're educators, yes. In the sense that they are in their pay, no. I have said on this group many times before that it is something I hear at home quite a lot, that we see the local dog sitters advertised more per hour than some childcare providers get. Kate, did you want to, was it your research that touched on that? It was, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the reason that I put that comparison in there was to explain why people are leaving for retail, which is what is empirically happening on the ground. So when we asked over and over again to staff, where do you plan to go if you're planning to leave, they either said Tesco or Aldi. This came up over and over again, exactly, Tesco or Aldi, or teaching. So it was either I want the progression that I can only get through teaching in primary or secondary school, or I want less responsibility for actually more pay. So that the pure point I was trying to make there is why retail is the destination that people are going to right now. Rather than comparing it in terms of the actual process or the skills involved in it.
I saw that the PVI sector is being destroyed. Is the government's intention just to move all early years into schools? I genuinely don't think that is the government's intention. I think that the government is just simply not understanding the sector and listening to the sector well enough. It is not there. If that is happening, it is a consequence, not a policy intention. Put bluntly, more cock up than conspiracy. Neither are good, which is why we exist, to try and impress on the ministers, and it's quite challenging because they change so regularly, but to impress on them the reality of life in the sector.
If I might add to you, please, is that Children's Commissioner's report published last week doesn't really acknowledge the fact that more than 70% of childcare is delivered by the PVI sector.
Correct.
Doesn't even acknowledge in the report the contribution that they make, not just to the economy, not just to the the development of children and support to families, which is really a shame that wasn't even acknowledged and recognised. Right. And everything to be school-based seems to be the answer. Which is kind of totally wrong, comparing, the PVI sector wages to school salaries, and to say that it's cheaper to run a provision in school is totally misguided. Yeah.
Okay, listen, thank you to all of our guests for joining us. The replay of this will be available on our social media channels in due course. I'm looking at that will be later on today. So it'll be on our Twitter feed that I read out earlier. Please share that. It's a huge number of people that take part in these sessions online, and that's very welcome. And we are here to support you as a sector and to represent you as a sector to ministers, whoever they may be, of whichever party. That is our job. So thank you very much. Enjoy the sunshine. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.